Okay, we have spent quite a bit of time going over various self motives, right? With things like self esteem and self efficacy, self regulation. Now, for the last couple of topics, we are going to get into more social motives. And so, a very important social motive is that of power. So, that's what we're going to go over in this topic. We'll go over first in this video types of power, and then we'll get into some motives behind the use of power before talking a little bit about just some outcomes that can occur from this use of power. So, types of power. The definition of power is domain specific asymmetric distribution of competence, resources, or status resulting in unilateral behavioral control. Try saying that 5 times fast, right? It's a very fancy way of defining power. So let's go through a couple of the specific aspects of this to clear it up a little bit. So we have domain specific. So this just means that the person has power in this one area. It's not a guarantee that the person has power or does not have power in a different area. It's domain specific. So an example of that is a boss, right? A boss has power in this one domain that is the work environment. Asymmetric. So one person or one group has either more competence, resources, or status, or all of the above, or various combinations of that, which give them power. And finally, unilateral behavioral control. So only those in power can coerce others to behave a certain way. It doesn't work the other way around, right? It's those that have the power with either competence, resources, or status that allows them to influence the behavior of others. And just another way that this can possibly be thought of is that um, power can be just the range of outcomes which can be forced upon someone else. So taxonomy of power, going to get into some different types of power, different ways in which people can hold power. So first is reward. So reward that is dependent on conformity, so influencing the way that people behave by saying, okay, if you do this, you'll get a reward. So an example of this is the boss has power by maybe being able to give certain bonuses, right? Rewards for meeting a sales quota or whatever it is based on that job. Coercive power is just the opposite of that, using the incentive of punishment. So punishment dependent on not doing whatever the behavior is. So if you don't do the work you're supposed to be doing, you can get fired. Or if you're a parent, you can put your child into timeout or something like that. There's legitimate power, which is where we have these norms or beliefs about authority in society. And so these people with authority then have legitimate power. And so that can occur with people like elected officials, right? We have these laws and systems determining how we elect officials. And so then the power that they are given once elected is legitimate. There's referent power, which occurs when there's the desire to be like someone. So the easiest example of this is celebrities or sports figures. Expert power, so possessing the certain skills or knowledge that a lot of other people don't have. So doctors would have this, right? We go to see a doctor for various health reasons, assuming that they're experts and can give us information that we can't otherwise get. And finally, there's informational power. So this sounds somewhat similar to the expert power, but with this communication of information, it doesn't necessarily mean that the person communicating the information is an expert in that field. So an example of this could be the media. And so different power types of power overlap with various persuasion tactics. And so there are 4 images here that can get at that. So pause the video and think about different aspects of power that might apply to each. We have Taylor Swift and Coke here, Gandhi, a SWAT team, and Messi, famous soccer player, if you're not that into sports, one of the best of all time, with Adidas here. So yeah, give the video a pause, think of what powers might apply to each, and we'll talk about a couple for each, assuming that you've paused and thought about this. And so for the first one, we have Messi and Adidas, right? So this is an example of that expert power where if Messi is buying certain cleats, being an expert in the game, the idea is that, okay, Messi should know a lot about this, so those cleats are probably good and high quality. This can also be that reference power, where a lot of, young soccer players are going to have the desire to be like Messi, and will want to identify more with what Messi is doing. Gandhi can be another example of referent power, can also be an example of informational power, right? Used information and that information to relay a certain message, a powerful message, right? To their people who ended up, a lot of those people ended up following Gandhi and Gandhi's ways. There's Taylor Swift with Coke. There's no reason to believe that Taylor Swift is an expert or anything on Coke, right? So this is more just that referent power, with Taylor Swift being a very well-known celebrity. And finally, we have this SWAT team here, where this can definitely be an example of coercive power. They have various weapons and guns, right? This can also be an example of legitimate power because we hire them to do these various jobs, right? And so the idea is that we pay them to go and do the things that SWAT teams do, and so their power should be legitimate. Now getting into, so we've talked about different types of power. How do we, from a psychology perspective, study power? Well, one of the main ways, and one that's gaining more and more popularity, is that of game theory. So this is part of an overall more broad economic approach. And what we can do in game theory is model asymmetric distribution or symmetric distribution of resources in more of a game format that we can actually study here. And so in these game formats, people will acquire a resource or an outcome. Oftentimes, this is in the format of either points or monetary bonuses or something like that. And the individual in these power scenarios is usually pitted against either a social or a joint benefit with others playing the game. And again, these games can be either symmetric or asymmetric. So by that, I just mean that the games can be set up where people either have equal power or they have different power. And so we'll go over actually a few examples of that. A very well-known example of this, and one that is used in psychology research, is the prisoner's dilemma. This is an example of a symmetric power game here. And what happens in the prisoner's dilemma is, well, the base of the games at least is on real life scenarios where, let's say, the police bring in two suspects and they're separated. And each suspect is separately told, okay, if you confess to this and throw your partner under the bus, we'll go easy on you and you'll get less of a punishment. And so there are four options for things that can happen here, right? There's either you confess, so you get less of a punishment, but still a punishment, and the other person, your partner, gets into more trouble. This is a pretty bad overall outcome, right? Because both people are still getting some extent of punishment. You cannot confess and your partner can confess, and then that's really bad for you because then you're the one who gets into a lot of trouble. Neither of you can confess, but this takes a lot of trust in your partner, right? That they're not going to confess as well. So then there's a chance here that you'll both get away with it. And then finally, you can both confess in terms of the outcome of going to prison or whatever it might be. This would be the worst for both of you because then both of you will get into a lot of trouble. And so a couple of additional ways in which we can study power using game theory that replicate various real life scenarios. The first is called Chicken. This is a game that a lot of people play when they're kids, I guess. But additionally, the classic game of Chicken is two cars are going towards each other, or motorized vehicles, whatever it might be. And then it's just a game of who will keep going straight and who will decide to swerve so that you don't crash. And then whoever swerves is the chicken in the game of Chicken. But you can also play this in terms of points here. And so you can have it so that if both players swerve, right, each would have 2 points. If you're player A and you go straight and the other player would swerve, then you get a lot of points. You get 4, the other person gets 0, and vice versa if you're the one to swerve. The worst outcome is obviously you crash, and then in the game, you both would lose 10 points each. So a lot of points in real life, that's bad because you both crash and probably die. So this is obviously the worst scenario here in the game of Chicken is you crash, nobody swerves. And so this gets at replicating various real life dilemmas, right? And so one example could be the Cold War, where it's kind of a game of chicken where there's an arms race, right? So trying to improve the weapons of each country, getting bigger and bigger weapons with worse outcomes. And so the idea is then, okay, who's going to be the country to stop and be like, okay, we don't want this crash, right? We don't want nuclear warfare on both sides that destroys both countries. So which country is going to swerve first? Additionally, there's this ultimatum game. This is an example. So we've talked about 2 symmetric examples. This is an example of asymmetric power. So in this, one individual gives an ultimatum and the other can either veto it or accept it. And so we can think of it in terms of player B can give the ultimatum and player A either accepts it or vetoes it. So player B can have 10 points and can say, okay, either we can split this evenly. I'll take 5 points. You take 5 points. Usually this has some type of monetary bonus associated with the points. And player A can accept this. Both get 5. Or if player A says no to any of the deals, neither player gets any points or any reward. But player B can also kind of take advantage of this, right? Knowing that, okay, if player A says no, neither of us gets points. So player A doesn't get any points or bonus. So then it makes sense for player A to accept anything because anything is better than 0. So I can say, okay, I'm player B. I'm going to take 9 of the points, but here you still get 1 that's better than 0. But player A might accept this because it's better than 0 points. Player A might also say, no, that's not fair. So neither of us get any points. And real life examples that kind of follow a similar type of system here would be passing laws, right? So Congress can write a legislation and then that can take the form of player B, and then the president can either accept this or leave it, but can't really change it or rewrite it or things like that. Either has to say, yes, let's do this, or no, this isn't okay, I'm not going to pass this. Additionally, another example could be salary negotiations. So oftentimes, with the unions or something like that, unions will present, okay, here's what we will accept or what we won't. And then those, in charge of the company or whatever the bosses decide, okay, this is something that we're willing to accept, we'll pay you this, or that's not going to happen, we won't do it. And so that's it for various types of power and how we can go about researching power in the field of psychology. Next, we'll talk about some motives behind the use of power.